The movie taught you that the Apache were a bunch of wild warriors running around screaming and attacking innocent settlers. Hollywood spent decades carefully building that image, so lovingly and with such dedication that people still believe it today. Reality, as usual, had the courtesy to be completely different. The Apache were a society with sophisticated social structure, their own legal system, advanced medicine, diplomacy, commerce, and an adaptability that would embarrass any modern business consultant. Living among them didn't mean spending your entire day in combat. It meant learning one of the most efficient survival systems the American continent ever produced. It meant mastering skills that the United States Army spent decades trying to understand and never fully replicated. It meant being part of a community where every person had function, responsibility, and value. What you could actually do living among Apache warriors would shock anyone who learned history through movies. Because the real history wasn't erased for lack of greatness. It was erased out of sheer convenience for whoever was writing the books. Running faster than a horse. The U.S. Army spent years chasing Apache warriors on horseback and always arriving late. It wasn't pure incompetence, though that explanation also helped. It was that Apache trained endurance running from childhood in a way that defied all Western military logic. Young warriors were required to run distances of 25 to 50 miles per day during training, carrying weight in their mouths to force nasal breathing and develop maximum lung capacity. A well-conditioned Apache warrior could cover 60 miles in a single day through mountainous Arizona terrain, while American soldiers mounted on well-fed horses lost the trail after a few hours. The soldiers needed provisions, horse fodder, tents, and logistical support. The Apache warrior needed his feet and knowledge of the terrain. The U.S. Army took decades to realize it was trying to win a race using a vehicle that needed fuel against an opponent who simply didn't need to stop. Drinking water where there is no water. The Arizona desert killed white settlers from thirst with an efficiency that bordered on art. Experienced men, well equipped with maps and provisions, died miles from water sources they simply didn't know existed. The Apache knew every spring, every temporary pool, every rock that collected moisture, every cactus that contained usable liquid across the entire region. That knowledge wasn't accident or mystical gift. It was science accumulated over centuries, passed down with precision from generation to generation. An Apache woman knew where to find water at any time of year within 60 miles of her territory. She knew which plants indicated a nearby water table, how to extract moisture from roots in an emergency, and how to purify stagnant water for safe consumption. The U.S. Army hired Apache scouts precisely because of this knowledge, and then, in a classic demonstration of government logic, treated those same scouts as second-class citizens once their knowledge was no longer needed. Healing wounds that killed soldiers. An arrow wound on the battlefield killed American soldiers with deplorable frequency, not necessarily from the wound itself, but from the infection that followed. 19th century military doctors had a very creative relationship with hygiene. Apache healers had a pharmacological repertoire developed over generations of rigorous experimentation with desert plants. They used ocotillo resin as an antimicrobial before the Western world knew what a microbe was. They applied sage leaf poultices to control inflammation. They treated wounds with yucca preparations that modern research has confirmed have real antibacterial properties. The survival rate of wounds treated by Apache healers was consistently higher than that of wounds treated by American military doctors of the same era. That's not romanticism. It's documented historical statistics. The United States had medical universities. The Apache had better outcomes. The comparison never appeared in official reports for reasons anyone can imagine. Navigating the desert at night without a compass. Getting lost in the Arizona desert at night was one of the most unpleasant ways to die available in the 19th century, and the menu had plenty of options. Apache warriors preferably moved at night precisely because the U.S. Army couldn't follow them in the dark without making enough noise to alert anyone within miles. Apache night navigation used stars, prevailing winds, ground temperature, and detailed topographical memory accumulated since childhood. A warrior knew where he was by looking at the position of specific constellations on the horizon, combined with the slope of the terrain under his feet. This wasn't a skill exclusive to specialists. It was basic competence expected of any adult in the community, equivalent to what today would be knowing how to read a GPS map. The difference is that GPS stops working when the battery dies, and the Apache warrior functioned under the same desert conditions for decades without needing technical support, building a shelter in 2 hours. The Apache wiki-up, the traditional dwelling structure, was a work of practical engineering that American settlers never managed to appreciate properly because they were too busy trying to destroy it. Built with bent branches covered in grasses, tree bark, or animal hide, a wiki-up could be raised by 2 people in less than 2 hours using materials completely available in the immediate Arizona environment. The structure was designed for the region's specific climate with a sophistication that modern architects recognize as functional. Natural ventilation controlled the internal temperature. The dome-shaped distributed wind and rain without creating pressure points. It was built to be dismantled in minutes when the band needed to move, because one of the advantages of not having fixed property was precisely not needing to defend it to the death against an army that had rifles and howitzers. Mobility was the strategy. The U.S. Army built permanent forts and waited for the enemy to show up at the door. The Apache simply never showed up, tracking a man for 3 days. Apache tracking was considered by the U.S. Army itself as the most advanced tracking skill ever documented on the continent. That's not generous praise. It's a belated and embarrassed acknowledgement from people who spent years trying to capture warriors who simply disappeared. An Apache tracker could determine from the shape of a footprint how many hours ago it was made, the individual's approximate weight, whether they were carrying something, whether they were tired or wounded, and which direction they were looking at the moment of the step. This reading wasn't mystical. It was data analysis with methods that modern forensic science spent decades systematizing in laboratories. The U.S. Army eventually acknowledged this practically by hiring Apache scouts as official trackers, paying them less than white soldiers of lower rank, naturally, because that kind of consistency the American government never broke, raising children to survive the impossible. Apache child rearing wasn't for the faint of heart, especially if you were the child in question. From a very young age, boys and girls learned tolerance to pain, hunger, and cold in a progressive and deliberate way. Not as punishment, as preparation for a world that would make no concessions. Children plunged into cold water at dawn in all seasons to build cold tolerance. They learned to go without eating for extended periods as endurance training, not as neglect. They ran increasing distances from the time they could walk. The system produced adults who could function under physical conditions that would incapacitate most professional soldiers of the 19th century. The U.S. government, upon realizing this, had the brilliant idea of solving the problem by sending those same children to boarding schools, where they tried to erase everything that made them extraordinary. The logic was admirable in its destructive consistency, speaking 5 languages out of necessity. Apache multilingualism wasn't an intellectual hobby. It was a survival tool developed out of historical necessity to interact with neighboring Navajo, Pueblo, Comanche, Mexican, and American neighbors without dying in the process. Apache leaders frequently spoke their own internal dialectal variants, the language of allied or rival tribes, enough Spanish to negotiate with Mexican traders, and enough English to identify when they were being cheated in treaties, which happened frequently enough to justify the investment in the language. Geronimo, who never signed a treaty without later discovering that the text didn't match what had been verbally promised, eventually learned to demand that agreements be read aloud in his presence by interpreters he trusted. That basic protective measure was described by the American press of the time as a demonstration of intransigence, requiring that an agreement say what you agreed to is apparently intransigence. Lesson learned. The diet that fueled warriors. The Apache diet was a combination of hunting, gathering, and small-scale agriculture that modern nutritionists analyzed with the seriousness of someone discovering the obvious belatedly. Deer, antelope, rabbit, peccary, edible insects, roots, berries, wild grass seeds, cactus fruits, agave prepared in multiple ways. The variety was an accident. It was the result of millennia of adaptation to an environment that killed those who couldn't read its possibilities. Agave was especially central. Cooked in underground pits for up to 48 hours, it provided complex carbohydrates of high caloric density that sustained long movements without the need for frequent resupply. Tiswin, a fermented drink made from corn or agave, had social and ritual function, not pathological. The U.S. government banned its production on reservations and then wrote concerned reports about alcohol consumption among indigenous peoples. Irony was never the federal administration's strong suit. The legal system, nobody studies. The Apache had a conflict resolution system sophisticated enough to have functioned for centuries without needing prisons, judges in wigs, or lawyers charging by the hour. Disagreements between community members were resolved through a council of elders with authority based on demonstrated reputation and wisdom, not hereditary title or military force. There was compensation for offenses, not just punishment. Murder within the community generated an obligation of reparation to the victim's family, not just punishment of the perpetrator, because the central concept was restoring community balance, not satisfying an abstraction called the state. Crimes considered irrecoverable could result in permanent expulsion, which, in the Arizona desert environment, was equivalent to a death sentence without having to get your hands dirty. The system worked. Not perfectly, because no system works perfectly, but it worked. The U.S. government replaced that system with reservations with minimal resources and arbitrary supervision. The results are documented and embarrassing for those who imposed them. Guerrilla warfare. Before guerrilla warfare had a name, U.S. Army generals wrote extensive reports on the impossibility of fighting the Apache in Apache territory using conventional tactics. Those reports were written with the appropriate dose of frustration from people who had spent years trying to apply European warfare manuals against an enemy who had never read those manuals, and consequently didn't know he was breaking the rules. The Apache used ambushes in chosen terrain, strategic retreat to exhaust the pursuer, quick attacks on supply lines instead of frontal confrontation, use of the environment as an active weapon, and mobility as a substitute for numerical superiority. These were principles that Mao Zedong would systematize decades later for modern guerrilla warfare, and that 20th century military theorists would describe as revolutionary. The Apache were doing this before 1800 because it was what the situation demanded, not because they had read military theory. Sometimes necessity is a better teacher than any academy. Improvised metallurgy. The Apache didn't have a developed metallurgy tradition before European contact, and they adapted available metal with a creativity that made professional metallurgists uncomfortable. When metal became available through trade, capture, and raids, Apache craftsmen learned to work iron and bronze without the formal instruments of the trade. Improvised blacksmiths used stones as hammers, bonfires as furnaces, and patience as a substitute for equipment they didn't have. Knives made by Apache craftsmen in the 19th century were analyzed by archaeologists who identified tempering and folding techniques that indicated functional metallurgical knowledge developed from direct experimentation, not formal instruction. The result was effective and durable tooling adapted to specific desert use conditions. No technical university, no manual, no master craftsman. Just observation, experimentation, and progressive refinement, which is coincidentally exactly how all human metallurgy began before anyone wrote a book about it. The emotional intelligence nobody documented. American soldiers who eventually served alongside Apache scouts in the 1870s and 80s recorded in personal diaries and letters something that official reports never mentioned. The Apache read people with disconcerting accuracy. They could assess in minutes whether an interlocutor was lying, nervous, confident, or afraid, based on a combination of body language, breathing patterns, facial microexpressions, and inconsistencies in verbal speech. This skill wasn't developed to impress. It was developed because living in disputed territory required quickly knowing whether the person in front of you was a threat, an ally, or a potential trading partner. Charles Gatewood, the American officer who played a central role in Geronimo's surrender in 1886, wrote that the Apache he worked with were the best judges of human character he had encountered in his life. Gatewood was subsequently ignored by the army and died in poverty. Consistency rewarded. The trade that financed resistance. The image of the Apache as a warrior who only knew how to fight and destroy was a convenient narrative to justify military campaigns against them. Reality included extensive trading networks that connected Apache groups with Pueblo, Navajo, Comanche, Mexican traders, and eventually Americans in a web of exchanges spanning centuries. The Apache traded hides, dried meat, crafts, and war captives for grain, textiles, metal tools, and horses. This trade was sophisticated enough to include credit, verbal contracts with community sanction, and price negotiation based on relative scarcity of goods. The horse was perhaps the most transformative addition to the Apache economy. After 1680, when the Apache had expanded access to horses following the Pueblo Revolt, their commercial and military mobility expanded dramatically. The U.S. Army meticulously cataloged horses captured from Apache groups. The reports never mentioned where those horses originally came from before reaching the Apache. Inconvenient details have a way of disappearing from records. Field surgery. Removing an arrowhead or bullet from the body of a wounded warrior without anesthesia, sterile surgical instruments, or anatomical knowledge by Western standards should have been a death sentence. For Apache warriors treated by healers from their community, it frequently wasn't. Apache healers developed projectile extraction techniques using combinations of improvised instruments of wood, bone, ion-polished stone in conjunction with plants with local anesthetic and antimicrobial properties. Jimson weed, plant native to the American Southwest, contains alkaloids that produce sedation and analgesia when properly prepared. Apache healers knew that preparation and its functional doses, the difference between therapeutic dose and lethal dose, for generations before any American pharmacist published about the active compound. American soldiers captured and later released by Apache groups documented having received medical treatment during captivity that was functional and humane. Those accounts appeared in American newspapers with the prominence they deserved, which was none. Practical astronomy. The Apache didn't build observatories or write astronomical treatises, which meant their astronomy was completely ignored by European academics, who defined what counted as legitimate knowledge. What they had was applied celestial knowledge of impressive precision. They could predict monsoon rains by the behavior of certain stars on the western horizon. They knew the lunar cycle in relation to game animal movements. They knew how to use the sun's position to determine time with a margin of error of 15 minutes without any instrument. Solstices and equinoxes were markers on the agricultural and ritual calendar. identified with enough consistency to plan plantings and seasonal migrations over decades. This body of knowledge was transmitted orally with precision that modern archaeologists verified by comparing traditional predictions recorded in the 19th century with historical climate data. The accuracy was substantial. Academic recognition was late, reluctant, and insufficient, as expected from a system that only recognizes as science what is written on paper. Raising horses without a veterinarian. The Apache adopted the horse more broadly after 1680, and in less than 2 generations developed horse breeding, training, and equine veterinary medicine that surprised Mexican and American observers who expected to see horses being mistreated. Apache horsemen could select for specific qualities in stallions and mares with a practical understanding of heredity that arrived at correct results without Mendel's theory to explain why. Apache horse training produced animals with desert tolerance, obedience under combat conditions, and endurance on long journeys that were consistently superior to American military horses fed grain rations. The American cavalry eventually recognized this and began acquiring horses of Apache origin or raised with similar methods for use in combat units in the Southwest. The observation that enemy methods produced better horses was recorded in internal reports. The logical conclusion that perhaps enemy methods deserved respect in other areas was also carefully ignored. The role of women, nobody told you about. American observers of the 19th century arrived in Apache territory with expectations formed by their own culture about what women should and shouldn't do, and left confused. Apache women were frequently owners of the Wickiup and its contents. Descent was often matrilinear in many groups, meaning children belonged to the mother's clan. High-status elder women participated in councils that made decisions about group movement and responses to external threats. Some Apache women participated directly in combat, not as heroic exception, but as an accepted function when circumstances demanded. Lozin, sister of leader Victorio, was recognized as a warrior and spiritual advisor, with combat skills that Victorio publicly described as superior to those of most male warriors. This information existed in American primary sources of the period. Popular history preferred to recount men's battles with more detail than the situation warranted, and silence women with more efficiency than honesty allowed. Long-distance communication. The telegraph was presented to the Western world as a revolution in long-distance communications. The Apache had a long-distance signaling system functioning decades before the first telegraph wire was installed in Arizona. Smoke signals and coded combinations transmitted messages between groups separated by dozens of miles with a speed that no horse messenger could equal in mountainous terrain. The system included coding complex enough to transmit not just simple alerts, but information about enemy numbers, direction of movement, civilian presence, and threat urgency. Mirror reflections using polished mica pieces were added to the repertoire after contact with metal technology, allowing instantaneous communication in clear sky conditions. The U.S. Army eventually adopted mirror signaling as standard military technique, calling it heliography, describing it in military manuals, without mentioning where the practical inspiration came from that soldiers saw working in the field. Credit attribution was never the Army's strong suit. Music as technology. Apache musical tradition wasn't entertainment in the Western sense of something you consume while sitting as others work. It was applied social technology with specific documented functions. Certain songs accompanied hunt preparation and activated states of concentration and fatigue resistance that functioned as systematic psychological preparation. Healing songs accompanied medical treatments and functioned partly as distraction, analgesia, and relaxation induction, a mechanism that Western medicine took until the 20th century to formally study. War songs served for group synchronization and maintenance of heightened alertness during nighttime movements. The oral transmission system for these songs included memorized precision of hundreds of distinct melodies with specific lyrics by shamans who took years of learning to master the repertoire. Ethnomusicologists who worked with Apache communities in the early 20th century documented songs with harmonic structures that defied categorization within Western musical systems. The music was complex, functional, and completely misunderstood by the observers who described it as primitive noise. The mental map that beat any chart. U.S. Army topographers who mapped Apache territory in the period between 1850 and 1890 produced maps that were functional as far as they went and dangerously incomplete in the rest. An Apache leader with 20 years of experience in his territory carried in memory a precise three-dimensional representation of thousands of square miles of desert, mountain, and canyon. That representation included locations of seasonal water, secret passages between valleys, natural refuges capable of sheltering 200 people and horses, escape routes for each usual camp location, and enemy patrol patterns compiled over years of observation. Geronimo, during his military campaigns of the 1880s, moved groups of up to 300 people through terrain the Army considered impenetrable using precisely that stored knowledge, while 5,000 American soldiers with official maps couldn't keep up. The maps cost the U.S. government fortunes. The mental knowledge was priceless because it wasn't for sale. The slave trade, the books skip. The complete history of the Apache, like any complete history of any people, includes aspects that don't produce simple hero and villain narratives. The Apache practiced capture and enslavement of enemy tribe members and, in specific periods, of Mexican and American settlers. This system was economically functional within the regional context of the time, and culturally analogous to what other Amerindian, African, Asian, and European societies practiced in their own contexts. Captives were often absorbed as community members after periods of servitude, with the possibility of social integration, marriage, and adoption of full status. This doesn't make the practice less violent or coercive for the individuals affected. It makes it historically analogous to the practices of the civilizations that sent troops to eliminate the Apache while defining themselves as morally superior. The comparison is uncomfortable for everyone, which is exactly why it appears in footnotes instead of main chapters in American history books, The Chess Game of Apache Diplomacy. The image of the Apache as a warrior who only understood fighting was particularly useful for justifying military campaigns, and conveniently ignored decades of diplomatic negotiation attempts that the Apache conducted, with results ranging from moderately bad to catastrophically bad, depending on who they were negotiating with. Cochise negotiated treaties with the U.S. government in 1872 that guaranteed his people the Chiricahua Reservation, the only piece of land they knew as home. Cochise died in 1874. 2 years later, while the body was still relatively fresh, the U.S. government dissolved the Chiricahua Reservation and forced resettlement to San Carlos, a completely different and inadequate territory for the group. Apache diplomacy had 900 years of history and produced agreements that both sides respected. American diplomacy with the Apache had the documented track record of being honored by the American side until the moment it stopped being convenient, which was consistently before the signature ink dried. The prisoner who became a warrior. The case of Lozin deserves more than a secondary mention in a list of curiosities. Lozin was the sister of Victorio, one of the most effective Apache military leaders of the 19th century, and was explicitly recognized by him as one of his most important military advisors. Victorio said, in words recorded by interpreters of the time, that Lozin was as strong as a man, braver than most, and a sister he couldn't have done without in battle. She participated in military campaigns alongside male warriors, not in a support role but in active combat function. After Victorio's death in 1880, Lozin continued fighting with Geronimo until the final surrender of 1886. She was deported with the other prisoners to Florida, then to Alabama, and died at Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama in 1889 from tuberculosis, the same disease that killed proportionally far more of the deported prisoners than any battle. American prisoner camps had remarkably creative sanitary efficiency. The children the government stole. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School opened in 1879 in Pennsylvania with the slogan that its founder, General Richard Pratt, was never ashamed to pronounce in public, "Kill the Indian to save the man." Apache children were removed from their families and sent to Carlisle and similar schools where practicing the Apache language was punished with physical beatings, where traditional clothing was confiscated and destroyed, where names were replaced with English names without consulting families, and where mortality from disease in populations without immunity to northeastern American pathogens reached rates that anyone with a basic sense of responsibility would classify as a crime. Apache children who were forced to attend Carlisle and return to the reservations frequently could no longer communicate with their own parents. That outcome was described in government reports of the time as progress. General Pratt died in 1924, celebrated as a humanitarian. Modern American history books mention Carlisle in footnotes when the courtesy of mentioning it occurs, the surrender that wasn't defeat. Geronimo's surrender in 1886 is frequently presented as the end of Apache resistance, a military defeat of the smallest band of warriors that resisted the most powerful army in the hemisphere. What the real numbers say is different. At the moment of the final surrender, Geronimo led a group of 36 people, including women, children, and elders. Against that group, the U.S. Army had mobilized 5,000 regular soldiers, 500 Apache scouts on the American side, and had active military cooperation from the Mexican Army. 2 national armies, 5,000 soldiers, and half a year of active campaign against 36 people. Geronimo wasn't captured. He negotiated his surrender after receiving guarantees that the U.S. government immediately violated by deporting him to Florida instead of resettling him in Arizona as promised. That wasn't defeat. It was sequenced betrayal of a man who trusted one last time in promises that the other party had not honored on any previous occasion. The man was naive. The government was consistent. The POW who became a circus attraction. After the deportation to Florida in 1886, Geronimo was transferred to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where he remained a prisoner of war for the rest of his life, despite never having been tried, convicted or formally charged with any specific crime within the American legal system. A prisoner of war for 23 years without judicial process is the kind of detail that defenders of American legality from other periods preferred not to discuss extensively. During that period, Geronimo was displayed at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in 1904 in St. Louis, where he sold autographs and photos to tourists fascinated by the man the U.S. Army had taken decades to subdue. He participated in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. Roosevelt, an enthusiast of hunting and American expansion, found it appropriate to include the country's most famous prisoner of war in the spectacle of democracy. Geronimo asked Roosevelt for permission to return to Arizona. Roosevelt refused. The show had to go on. The legacy that survived everything. In 1941, when the U.S. Army created its first elite paratrooper battalion, the soldiers who made the first training jump shouted the name Geronimo as they leaped. The story of how that started varies, but the result is documented. The name of the prisoner of war the Army spent decades chasing became the battle cry of the U.S. Army. In 1945, the project that developed the first atomic bomb at Los Alamos was executed partly on territory in New Mexico that had been Apache territory. In 2011, the U.S. military operation that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden received the code name Operation Geronimo. Geronimo's family publicly protested. The U.S. government saw no problem with the association. The man who was a prisoner of war without trial for 23 years, who asked to go home and was refused, who sold autographs to American tourists as a fair attraction, has his name shouted by the military that imprisoned him and given to operations by the government that kept him in captivity. American irony is profound and consistently unintentional. The scouts who saved the Army. While the U.S. government was conducting military campaigns against the Apache, the U.S. Army was hiring Apache as scouts to help track other Apache. The Apache scout position was official, with government pay and U.S. military uniforms. They were used extensively during the final campaigns against Geronimo. Without them, the consensus of the generals involved was that the campaigns would have been impossible, or would have lasted considerably longer. The Apache scouts provided the terrain knowledge, tracking skills, and cultural intelligence that American soldiers simply didn't have and couldn't develop in useful time. After the campaigns, when immediate utility had passed, the Apache scouts received the recognition they deserved for the extraordinary contribution they had made. That recognition was denied for decades, with a consistency that suggested deliberate policy. In 2024, the U.S. Congress passed legislation granting retroactive military honors to Apache scouts who served in the 19th century, 140 years late. At least the math was right this time. The San Carlos Reservation. In 1875, the U.S. government made the geographically creative decision to concentrate several distinct Apache groups onto a single reservation at San Carlos, Arizona, in territory that government agents themselves described in internal correspondence as inadequate for human sustenance. San Carlos was low, hot, subject to seasonal malaria, and without the hunting and gathering resources the Apache groups relocated there depended on for survival. Groups that were historically and culturally distinct, some of which had active rivalry relationships with each other, were forced to coexist in insufficient territory with scarce resources. And the predictable result was tension, conflict, and starvation that produced the same escapes and resistances the government then used as justification for additional military campaigns. John Clum, San Carlos Reservation agent in the 1870s, wrote in his diaries that the system was designed to create exactly the conditions it was producing. Clum was eventually removed from his position. The policy continued, what the Apache language saved. During World War II, the U.S. Army developed a code communication system based on American indigenous languages, whose interception and decoding by the Japanese was considered practically impossible. The Navajo Code Talkers are the most famous, but similar programs used other languages, including Apache variants. The logic was simple to the point of embarrassment, the language that the U.S. government had spent decades trying to eradicate in boarding schools. The language whose practice was punished with physical violence in federally funded institutions became a critical military tool when the same nation that tried to destroy it needed it to win a war. Apache speakers who grew up hiding their language from American authorities were recruited by the U.S. Army to use that same language in service of the nation that tried to erase it. That level of irony generally requires paid screenwriters to produce. American history manages it for free. What remains? Today, there are approximately 63,000 recognized members of Apache nations in the United States, distributed among reservations in Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. The White Mountain Apache Nation manages one of the most successful timber operations in the American Southwest. The Mescalero Apache Nation operates a ski resort at Sierra Blanca that is one of the largest employers in southern New Mexico. The Fort Sill, Apache Nation, direct descendants of Geronimo, was formally recognized by the federal government only in 1976, 90 years after the deportation of their ancestors. The Apache language is in an active process of revitalization, with language immersion programs for children operating in several communities. Knowledge of medicinal plants, traditional cooking, ceremonial music, and construction techniques is being documented by community members who understood that dependence on human memory for knowledge transmission has an expiration date. The Apache survived everything the US government applied with more creativity than efficiency. That is no small thing.